Welcome back to A Localized Journey, the series where we take a long, hard look at the localization of various games across time. Picking up where we left off last time in Pokemon Red, we've just finished saving Saffron City from the clutches of Team Rocket and can now finally accomplish our main goal here, which is of course defeating this city's gym leader. However, before we get to Saffron Gym, there are, as you might expect, a few new lines of dialogue from the citizens of the town that have seen some changes during localization that I'd like to go over. To start off, we come across our old friend Removed Detail when talking to a certain woman in town. In Japanese, she says, "For a while, Yamabuki City was diminished because people ran away, but it'll become a lively city once again." This was localized to, "People should be flocking back to Saffron now," in the English version of the game. While the implications here are rather similar, the amount and clarity of the information given are clearly very different. In the original Japanese, we have a clear understanding that people fled Saffron City in fear of Team Rocket, but in the English, we only know that some unspecified group of people will be flocking to Saffron City now that Team Rocket is gone. The strangest thing about this localization change, in my opinion, though, is that the focal point of the conversation has been completely changed. In Japanese, the main focus of this dialogue is on the people that fled Saffron City. There isn't even any direct mention of people returning, we just know that the city will become lively once again. While it is true that it's implied that people will return by the making of this claim, it is by no means the focus of the conversation. However, despite this fact, the English sentence is entirely centered around the idea of people returning to Saffron City. In my opinion, even if you're going to shorten a piece of dialogue, you should still try to keep the heart of the conversation the same. That way we won't lose as much information as we did in this case. Next up, we have a bit of an interesting one. When speaking to a man on the west side of town, he says in Japanese, apparently it was just one person who took out Team Rocket. That's impressive. So clearly this guy has absolutely no idea who it was that took out Team Rocket. If he did, he wouldn't be telling us it was just one person because we're that one person. You see where this is going. In the English version of the game, this guy says, "You beat Team Rocket all alone? That's amazing." So for whatever reason, they made it so that it's a known fact that we were the ones that defeated Team Rocket. In fact, it almost seems like we were the ones who initiated this conversation and told this guy that we single-handedly beat Team Rocket, like we just wanted to brag or something. I much prefer the idea that we're just some unknown hero who swoops in, beats Team Rocket, and doesn't make a big deal about it. We don't need this guy to know it was us who beat Team Rocket because we didn't do it for the recognition. Even when he directly brings up our accomplishment, we just move on without saying a word. This is a much better portrayal of the classic silent Pokemon hero in my opinion, which is why I believe it should not have been changed. A bit later in a house in Saffron City, we meet a boy who tells us about the copycat. In Japanese, she is known as the Monomane Musume, or Impression Girl. Personally, I never really liked the name Copycat for this character. Not only does it sound a bit weird due to the fact that Copycat isn't usually used in the context of naming, it also gives us much less information about the character than the original Japanese name. We know she's a copycat, but what does that mean? What does she copy? Why is she called copycat when that's typically a negative term? The term monomane used in Japanese typically refers to the impersonation of things like other people, animals, etc., etc. But when we hear copycat in English, we don't really think of impersonations. We think of an annoying little kid who keeps repeating everything someone says. The two names have completely different connotations across regions, which should never be the goal of any localization. Another guy we meet in Saffron has Japanese dialogue that goes, "I flew here on my Pidgeot because I heard Sylph was attacked by Team Rocket and it became a big incident. It's already been taken care of? Sorry for being such a rubbernecker." In English, this conversation was changed to be, "I flew here on my Pidgeot when I read about Sylph. It's already over? I missed the media action." I'm honestly not sure what the English localization was going for with the whole "I missed the media action" part here. On my first read of it, I thought it was implying that this guy wanted to swoop in and save Saffron from Team Rocket to garner some media attention or something like that, but with the context of the Japanese, it could also mean that he wanted to see all the media here because he's a rubbernecker at his core. Either way though, this is a very unclear statement in English that really didn't need to be changed at all. But anyway, now it's time to move on to the Saffron Gym. One of the first trainers we fight in the gym tells us that the gym leader here is called Natsume in Japanese. Like many other characters in the original Pokemon, this name comes from a type of plant. In this case, that plant is a tree called a Natsume that originates from China. It bears plum-like fruit that seems to typically be dried and then eaten. Not really much else to say here, it's just a tree with fruit. The same trainer we were just talking to turns out to be the first psychic we've encountered. In Japanese, the psychic trainer type is referred to as Psychica, or Psychicer. Now, in all honesty, this isn't a really big change or anything, and the English name does make more sense to an English speaker, but personally I probably would have just left the original name as it was anyway. Psychic is a pretty well-known loanword from English and Japanese, so if the developers wanted this type of trainer to just be called Psychic, then they would have used that name. Also, leaving the name as it was would avoid confusion with the Pokemon type known as Psychic in English, which also wasn't a problem in Japanese, because that type is called Esper, not Psychic. This Psychic happens to have a Slowbro among his Pokemon, which is the first time we've gotten to see one. In Japanese, Slowbro is known as Yadoran. Similar to Slowpoke or Yadon, this name comes from the Japanese name for hermit crab or Yadokari. However, in this case we also have another rather odd source for the name, which is that of a Yugoslavian singer named Jadranka Stojakovic. I'm assuming I butchered that pronunciation, but I am confident I can pronounce the transliteration of her name into Japanese, which is Jadranka Stojakovici. You can see the connection here. Apparently, Jadranka came to know some of the Pokemon development team through some means, most likely due to her working for several decades in Japan as a singer, and they decided to slip her name into the game as a little Easter egg. I'm not sure how I'd feel about lending my name to Slowbro of all Pokemon, but still pretty neat. To finish things off with this Psychic, let's talk about his loss quote. In Japanese, he simply says, "I lost." But in English, for whatever reason, this was lengthened to, "I lost my concentration." If there was still any doubt that saving on cartridge space is a terrible excuse for the over-localization of this game, this should put those to rest. The English localization is literally 4 times as long as the original for absolutely no reason whatsoever. If you didn't slip the whole concentration thing in there to try and spice up the dialogue, you could have saved on a lot of space, but I guess that wasn't really the top priority here, now was it? A different Psychic in the gym has pre-battle dialogue that goes, "Do you think espers that use unseen powers are scary?" in Japanese. This was localized into English as, "Does our unseen power scare you?" Once again, we see the focus of a sentence changed, in this case from espers that use unseen powers to the unseen powers themselves. In the English, it seems like the Psychic is sort of taunting us by remarking on how one might find psychic abilities scary, while in the original Japanese, he just seems to be asking a genuine question. Of course, this does depend on how you read the individual sentences, but that's at least how they came across to me when I played. Either way though, the English localization has much more of an air of bragging and taunting about it than the original. Yet another Psychic we run into in Saffron Gym says, "Saffron Gym, also known as the Esper Training School. You're trying to meet Sabrina, aren't you? I know it." This dialogue was pretty drastically changed to, "Saffron Pokemon Gym is famous for its psychics. You want to see Sabrina, I can tell." So rather than the gym being a place where psychics are trained, the gym is just famous for its psychics in English. This isn't a steakhouse with a world-famous ribeye, it's a Pokemon gym. The fact that psychics are trained here gives so much flavor to the story of the gym and helps to build up the player's mental image of it. In the English game, however, it's just a bland old gym famous for its psychics, which we could already tell based on the fact that it's full of psychics. Horrible localization choice. Finally, we move on to Sabrina, and she has seen a few localization changes as well. Her pre-battle dialogue in Japanese is, "So you've come after all. I had a feeling. Ever since I threw that spoon for no particular reason and it bent, I've been an Esper girl. I don't like fighting, but if you wish, I will show you my powers." The English version of this text is, "I had a vision of your arrival. I've had psychic powers since I was a child. I first learned to bend spoons with my mind. I dislike fighting, but if you wish, I will show you my powers." Now, I don't know about you, but to me, the Japanese version of Sabrina just seems like a normal, even gentle girl who doesn't like fighting and got roped into this whole psychic thing because of her outstanding abilities. On the flip side of this, the English Sabrina sounds much more intimidating, even if they did leave in the line about her not liking to fight. Once again, she seems to be bragging about her abilities, which is the furthest thing from the case in the original Japanese. They may have wanted her dialogue to sound more unnerving in English for whatever reason, which, as we all know by now, I can't sign off on as a legitimate localization change. I much prefer the gentle nature of the original Sabrina, and I genuinely think her character had more depth to it in Japanese. But I guess that's pretty much the case with every gym leader we've seen thus far. Sabrina also happens to be the first trainer we've seen with a Venomoth, so let's talk about its Japanese name. In Japanese, Venomoth is known as Morufon. This is a very simple name that comes from the Morufo Cho, or Morpho butterfly, a genus of butterfly comprised of many different individual species and subspecies. In my opinion, this is a great example of a Pokemon name that did not require a change at all and was still changed at the whim of the localizer. Morpho is an English word that is uncommon enough to not be weird as a name, and has even been modified further with the N on the end, so I can't use the defense that this is just a plain English word either. Of all the Pokemon names we've encountered thus far, this is the one that needed a change the least in my opinion. It should have just been left alone. The rest of Sabrina's dialogue, like her loss quote and post-battle conversation, have seen a few minor changes, but nothing too interesting, so we'll give them a pass this time. Instead, I'd like to move over to the area west of Celadon City, where our journey continues. If you know about Pokemon Red, you'll know west of Celadon City is where we get the HM for Fly, and the conversation that leads up to the acquisition of that HM is our next topic. We find a young girl in a house alone with her pharaoh, and she says in Japanese, "Oh dear, you found me. Don't tell anyone about me. I'll give you this, so please." In English, this same dialogue reads as, "Oh, you found my secret retreat. Please don't tell anyone I'm here. I'll make it up to you with this." So obviously in Japanese there is no indication that this is a so-called secret retreat. We only know that this girl is in a rather hard to find location and we found her. Just another example of punched up dialogue with no apparent reasoning behind it other than the localizer thought it sounded cool. In the second sentence here, the thing this girl is trying to keep a secret has been changed. In Japanese, she doesn't want us to tell the people about her, while in the English, she doesn't want us to tell the people that she's here. Now, you could argue that these sentences could be read in a way that makes them have a similar meaning, but either way, there isn't a reason to go beyond what is present in the original text. Why introduce an element of possible misunderstanding when you could just leave the original dialogue as it is and move on? The issue with the last sentence here is that the layout has been altered for no apparent reason. In Japanese, the plea comes at the end of the sentence, while in English, it's at the beginning. Once again, this isn't a huge deal at all, but it's still an arbitrary change. Following this conversation, we receive the HM for Fly, and in Japanese, it specifically says we received the HM from the girl, while in English, we just receive it as usual. This is something we've seen before, and it still doesn't make sense. Why remove what is, at most, 3 very short words, when we've seen on many occasions you were okay with adding in your own words for no reason? This double standard is one of the main reasons why I'll never buy the excuse that cartridge space was that much of an issue for the localization of Pokemon Red. The move Fly in Japanese is known as Sora o Tobu, which literally means to fly the sky. Now, as you all know, I'm not a fan of changing the names of things in any way during localization, but if you really had to change this one, I think Soar would have been a better option than just Fly. If the developers wanted the name of the move to be Fly, they would have just called it Tobu, not Sora o Tobu. Soar gives off a closer feeling to the original name, so I would have definitely gone with that if leaving the original wasn't an option. After we get the HM, the girl gives us the rundown on how Fly works, and in Japanese this explanation is, Hidden Machine 02 is Fly the Sky. It's a very convenient and magnificent move. Use it with care. The English here is HM02 is Fly. It will take you back to any town. Put it to good use. The worst thing here by far is how blatant the English version is with the explanation. Why not let the player have a moment where they figure out what the HM does on their own, rather than tell them directly? It's not in the original game, so why add it in? This is a type of change we've seen a lot so far, where the localizer for some unknown reason felt the need to clarify something that didn't need clarifying, or was better left unclarified because it let the player figure things out for themselves. I get the main audience is children, but come on, this didn't need to be changed. We also see another arbitrary change here in the form of the way the girl says to use the HM she gave us. In Japanese she says use it with care, while in English she says put it to good use. The Japanese implies that this is a very rare or sought-after HM, so we should use it as such, whereas the English makes it seem like the girl wants us to use it willy-nilly. The meanings and implications here are basically the exact opposite, so there's definitely no defending this in my mind. If there was a reason for this change, I'd love to hear it, but sadly I doubt there was. As I mentioned before, in this house there is also a pharaoh, and I just thought I'd mention that like many other Pokemon you can talk to in Pokemon Red, the cry we read in the dialogue box is basically unchanged across regions, which is very odd for a game with this level of localization. Something like this being unchanged, although it is small, gives me some hope that all isn't lost with this game in terms of localization, but I guess maybe that's just wishful thinking by this point. Still nice to see though. Next, I'd like to move on to Cycling Road, but as you may know, a Snorlax blocks our path. In Japanese, the dialogue when you talk to this Snorlax is, the Pokemon appears to be sleeping very pleasantly, and in English it's, a sleeping Pokemon blocks the way. Once again, very boring dialogue from the English version. We get no description of the Pokemon other than the fact that it's sleeping, and we see the localizer yet again has no confidence in our ability to figure out that we're supposed to try to get past this Pokemon because they specifically added the part about the Pokemon blocking our path. The English is just so much worse here, which is really an accomplishment in and of itself for a sentence this short. After we play the Poke-Flute for Snorlax, it wakes up and, you guessed it, the dialogue here has seen some localization. In English, we get Snorlax woke up, it attacked in a grumpy rage. And in Japanese, we get Snorlax woke up, the half-awake Snorlax attacked. So no, Snorlax wasn't angry or filled with rage at the fact that we woke it up. It was just still half asleep, so it had no idea what was going on, which fits with the design of the Pokemon. It's honestly beyond me as to why the change had to go this far here, because we've essentially rewritten the entire personality of a Pokemon in one sentence. I know I said the last sentence was an accomplishment, but this is something else. Now for a change of pace, let's talk about Snorlax's Japanese name. In Japan, Snorlax is known as Kabigon. This comes from the nickname for one of Game Freak's employees, Nishino Koji, who was the inspiration for Snorlax. His nickname was apparently Kirby, so they slipped that into Snorlax's Japanese name. Another possible origin is the Japanese word kabi, which means mold. The idea being that Snorlax sleeps so much and doesn't move that mold grows on him. Furthering this idea is Snorlax's Gigantamax form, where an entire meadow grows on his stomach. Once we're past Snorlax, we enter the gate leading to Cycling Road. On the upper floor, we run into a guy who says, "I'm going cycling with my girlfriend on my brand new bike," in Japanese. This conversation in English, however, is just, "I'm going for a ride with my girlfriend." We lose all information about the bike, the cycling becomes just a ride, and overall it's just a boring sentence with no character whatsoever as a result. As with many changes we see, this is by no means a change to a major plot point or character, but it's still a reduction to the overall world that is Pokemon Red. Changes to things like this that on their own may not matter much add up to an overall worse experience for English players, and that's why I try to not let things like this slide. Finally, moving on to the actual Cycling Road, we run into a rather impolite gentleman who says, "What do you want?" in English, and "Dato kurra," which I just wanted to say because it sounds funny, but it essentially means something like, "What did you say, punk?" If you've seen a decent amount of anime, you've probably heard this used before by various delinquents and other such unpleasant folk. It also obviously in no way means, "What do you want?" The implication here that I see is that we said something to this fellow and he responded in typical delinquent fashion. This context is completely lost on English players. Now, if you know a bit about Japanese culture and you hear a guy on a bike say "Dato kurra," you might assume, like I did, that he is a member of a Bousouzoku. Bousouzoku is a term for a group of Japanese thugs and/or delinquents that ride motorcycles and really like to squat for some reason. Seriously, they're always squatting. Bousouzoku are often associated with less than great things like gang violence, vandalism, and pompadours. If you just think of them as Japanese biker gangs made up of mostly teenagers, you'll be fine. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, it turns out that the trainer type known as biker in English is actually Bousouzoku in Japanese. We meet a lot of bikers on the Cycling Road, including the guy we just spoke to, so I figured now was as good a time as any to go over some Japanese culture. Now, you may know there is one more new trainer type that we run into on Cycling Road, and that is of course Cue Ball. In Japanese, this trainer type is known as Skinheadsu, or skinheads. Yes, specifically skinheads and not skinhead for whatever reason. Now obviously this name wouldn't work in the West because of the negative connotations here, so I can't really fault the localizer on this one. What I can say is that the choice of Cue Ball maybe wasn't the best, seeing as it is somewhat of a derogatory term against the follically challenged. They would eventually choose to change the name to Roughneck, presumably for this reason. Another Cue Ball we face later on has intro dialogue that differs across regions. In Japanese he says, "I'll take good care of you," which is used in an ironic sense, meaning he intends to beat you in a battle. The English version of this is, "Come out and play Little Mouse." Just, wow, where do I even begin? So not only was this localized to something longer than most, if not all, direct translations, it also pretty much completely diverges from the original meaning of this sentence. And the whole little mouse thing, what even is that? Why add something so specific and cringe to a sentence where it wasn't even close to being mentioned? It's just a really weird decision that I can't wrap my head around. As for the "come out and play" part, I guess maybe that was supposed to be referencing the original intention of the sentence, but it sure didn't do a great job of it. Definitely one of the weirdest and just straight up worst localizations we've seen yet. Continuing our talk on rodents, and yes it does continue, this Cue Ball also mentions them when he loses in English. He says, "You little rat." Now, if the previous localization has taught us anything, it's that the rodent part came out of absolutely nowhere, and that is of course the case. In Japanese, this line is kono yaro, meaning something like "why you" in this context. If you really wanted to stretch the meaning of localization, you could say that "you little rat" could work here, but even then, the rat part comes out of nowhere. Why not just say something like "why you little"? That would have kept things closer to the source, while also not jamming in the word rat. But why am I even trying to salvage this localization when it was literally just done to connect back to the previous mouse line, which also made no sense? Let's move on. Later on, we run into a guy who wants a distraction from his woes. In Japanese, he says, "I'm in a bad mood right now. I want to blow off some steam." This was changed to "I'm feeling hungry and mean" in English. In terms of where the hunger part came from, your guess is as good as mine. It's also really weird to say "you're feeling mean," like that's just not something people say. He was just in a bad mood, he wasn't feeling mean, whatever that means. Not to mention the complete removal of his desire to use our battle as a way to blow off steam, which gave the situation more context. Yet another cue ball we encounter says, "You're a cheeky brat" in Japanese, which was for some reason changed to "bad, bad, bad" in English. You know, I'm starting to get the feeling that a lot of these changes are just random shoehorned in pop culture references that I just don't get. Either way, this is just a horrible localization, plain and simple. Another biker in this same area has pre-battle dialogue that goes, "Hyo hyo, I'll play with you a bit," in Japanese if you couldn't tell by the hyo hyo. This same dialogue in English is just, "Sure, I'll go." Go where? What does this sentence even mean? What is it in reference to? We have no idea. If you wanted to remove the hyo hyo, fine, I'm not going to complain about that too much, but you could have just left the rest of the dialogue alone and been totally fine, so why change it? Once again, your guess is as good as mine. This same biker had his lost dialogue changed as well. In Japanese, it's "ahyo," just a simple exclamation that you could equate to any number of English exclamations. We've seen this done a number of times already in Pokemon Red, so this time should be the same, right? Of course not. Why would we ever expect something like consistency from a localization? We got "crash and burn" in English. That's a long way off from an exclamation, I tell you what. It's also much longer than many equivalent exclamations, so yet again we're adding characters for no reason. Just an absolute masterclass in how not to localize something. Later down the road, we encounter a biker who says in English, "We're bikers, highway stars." Now, in my opinion, the mark of a really great localization is the ability to read the localized text and then instantly know what the original source text was. And if you thought that was the case here, you couldn't be more wrong. The Japanese text is "We're bo sozoku." We can even quiet a crying baby. The phrase "naku ko mo damaraseru," meaning to be able to quiet even a crying baby, is a fairly common Japanese figure of speech that means something is really great or impressive. Now, of course, this is a very Japanese phrase, but that doesn't mean it doesn't make sense in English. It's a fairly straightforward concept that I don't think requires that much explaining, maybe an extra word or two, but that shouldn't be an issue based on the amount of additions to the text that we've seen thus far. Either way, though, highway stars just isn't a good localization. It sounds dumb, it doesn't go with the theme of mean bikers, and it's not even close to the original intention. Really, can't get much worse than that. A bit further on, we meet a guy who's out of breath. In Japanese, he says, "I'm tired. I'm sleepy. This is a pain in the butt." The English version of this is, "Get lost, kid. I'm bushed." So right off the bat, we lost the sleepiness in translation, so that's not great. He also says, "Get lost, kid" in English, implying that we're bothering him, but in Japanese, we're only conveyed the fact that he doesn't like climbing up the steep cycling road. It's kind of weird to just randomly make this guy a jerk to a kid for no reason when he wasn't a jerk in the original Japanese. The weirdest thing, though, is that this isn't the first time we've seen a change like this. Several times so far, people have been made much meaner and angrier towards us when we haven't done anything wrong. Definitely a weird trend to see. A biker later on says, "I have confidence in my stamina. Come at me," in Japanese, which was changed to "What do you want, kiddo?" in English. Literally everything is different here yet again. Why are we so insistent on removing references to the climb uphill being tough? It's just a normal concept that anyone can understand. Walking, or in this case biking uphill, is tiring. It's not a reference to Japanese culture or anything like that, so why remove it? It just doesn't make a lot of sense, or really any sense at all. Once we finally reach the gate that leads us to Fuchsia City, we encounter a fellow who offers to trade us a Lickitung. Lickitung's Japanese name is Beroringa. This name comes from a bunch of different sources, the obvious of which are the Japanese word bero meaning tongue, and berori or berorin being an onomatopoeia for the licking sound. There's also the transliteration of the English word lingual or ringaru, meaning of the tongue, and yet another reference to an alien from the Ultra 7 series. In this case, that alien is known as the Peroringa Seijin, or Peroringa alien. The names are literally one character off, like many of the other Ultraman and Ultra 7 references we've seen thus far. It would probably be an understatement to say that the Game Freak staff were big fans of Ultraman at this point. Also, just a random thing, this guy we're talking to was changed from a chef to a normal boy NPC for some reason. Not sure when this change took place, but still pretty random. After we exit the gate, we encounter a few bird keepers who of course had their trainer type changed. In Japanese, bird keepers are known as toritsukai, meaning bird user. The connotation here is of someone who uses birds for battle or tames wild birds, not one of someone who just keeps birds. This was possibly a change made to avoid animal rights issues in the West, but it's still a pretty lame change because this was definitely a harmless name in my opinion. One of these bird keepers happens to have a pharaoh, and this is the first time we've battled one, so let's talk about its Japanese name. Pharaoh is called Oni Doriru in Japanese, which is a very straightforward name. It partially comes from the Japanese Oni, which is a pretty well-known monster in Japanese folklore. Oni is usually translated as something like ogre or demon depending on the context, but there really isn't a perfect translation seeing as it's a purely Japanese concept. We also have the transliteration of the English word drill or doriru here, and that's pretty much all there is to this name. Another bird keeper we battle here has a lost quote that reads, "I had to bug you," in English. The Japanese version of this is, I guess if the pheasant doesn't cry, it won't be shot. If the pheasant doesn't cry, it won't be shot is a Japanese koto waza or proverb that means if you don't say anything unnecessary, you'll avoid much misfortune. It's a very Japanese saying, isn't it? But either way, it was completely removed from the English, possibly because of the reference to shooting, which wouldn't do super well over here, even though America has guns and Japan doesn't. It's backwards, I know, but that's Western media for you. And to end things off, let's talk about a Pokemon I ran into in the grass around here, Doduo. In Japanese, Doduo is known as Dodo or Dodo. It's literally just a dodo bird. Once again, I don't really feel like this had to be changed because dodos aren't super well-known creatures, especially to kids, so just having the name Dodo would have been fine in my opinion. I guess there really was just one character added for the English name though, so not a huge deal. Hey, I think that's the first time we've ended on a semi-positive note. Always nice to get a change of pace every now and then, I guess. But anyway, thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. It always means a lot to me, especially in a video like this that's part 8 of a series and still pretty long. If you happen to enjoy today's video, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out.